Hello, and thank you for joining Edge for our latest Speaker Series event. Today, we have a slightly different format for you. We are going to be recording a conversation with Dan Clifton, primarily focused on the pending tax policy changes we expect this year. It's a very relevant topic that will have an impact on every American as Congress debates President Biden's proposed infrastructure plan. I want to give you a little bit of background on Dan for those of you who may not know him. Dan Clifton is a partner and head of policy research for Strategas Securities. In this capacity, Dan Clifton evaluates financial market implications of policy and political developments. He leads the #1 ranked Washington policy team, according to Institutional Investor magazine, and we certainly agree with that. Mr. Clifton has been ranked as a top analyst in the category of tax and accounting policy, which is particularly relevant today. Prior to joining Strategas, Mr. Clifton was the executive director of the American Shareholders Association, the ASA. That's a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that analyzes public policy affecting shareholders. Prior to joining the ASA, Mr. Clifton was a federal affairs manager for the Americans for Tax Reform, and he served as a senior staff member on 2 gubernatorial administrations working on economic and fiscal policy issues. Mr. Clifton received a BA in urban planning and an MS in public policy from Rutgers University, where he was a fellow at the Eagleton Institute of Politics and a Harold Martin Fellow for Public Policy. Dan, that's quite a resume. We are so fortunate to have you today to share your insights with our clients. We want to start with the basics and reviewing President Biden's fiscal policy plan, including his thoughts on the COVID and infrastructure proposals that are in place. There are heavy corporate and individual tax increases in those plans. Can you please frame these proposals with the basics, help our clients understand what is included in these plans, and specifically touch on the various revenue increases that we would see coming out of any enactment later on this year in the infrastructure plan in particular?
Absolutely. First, thank you for having me. It's great to be here with you today. And I think this conversation is very timely. On May 28th, President Biden will put out his full budget proposal, which will have all of his spending and hit all of his tax increases. At that moment is when you start to get what I call the meat on the bones of exactly what he wants to do on timing and rates of different types of tax increases, as well as the spending proposals. And so that is really the last step before Congress begins debating these issues. And we have a generally good idea of what those proposals are. And I think we can have a great conversation about them today. Let me just take a step back. And if we think about where we are today, it's a very different world than where we were 15 months ago with the country locking down and COVID. We are now reaching what I call adult herd immunity. That means Americans are starting to come back. Every state is now at least 50% open, and you are just starting to see a bit of normality come back. The Biden strategy on fiscal policy has really been twofold. In the first quarter of this year, upon entering office, it was about getting emergency COVID aid into the pipeline. That means more money for consumers, more money for vaccines, more money for testing. And we're now starting to see the effect of these different types of fiscal policies. Interestingly, the president distributed almost $500 billion of aid to consumers in the month of March, and you're getting stronger economic growth from that. And you're also getting bottlenecks in the supply chain because we've given consumers all this money, but we haven't had any production to actually supply those goods. And so as we begin to debate infrastructure, green energy, and tax increases, you have tailwinds and headwinds going in for the Biden administration. And the tailwinds are they have a good economy coming into effect. They have broad public support. But the headwinds are they have rising interest rates, concerns about inflation, and just questions about whether we need trillions of dollars of more spending if the emergency is starting to go away from COVID-19. What Biden said is that one, the COVID aid should be the emergency aid and immediate, but the infrastructure package should be a lot of spending and over a long period of time. He likes to refer to this as build back better. The United States will be building back its infrastructure better. And he broke that program into two parts. The first is physical infrastructure. It is $2.2 trillion over the next 8 years. The second package is what I call social policy. They call it social infrastructure. And that's, again, about $2 trillion over 8 years. Let's break those packages apart. What is included in those infrastructure? Well, traditionally, highways, roads, and bridges, $100 billion. Another $80 billion for roads, $100 billion for water, so that we don't have contaminated lead water pipes like you saw in Flint, Michigan several years ago. $100 billion for the grid, so that we can upgrade the electrical grid, given the issues that happen in Texas and the issues that are going on with the Colonial Pipeline. And then $100 billion for broadband. Now, there are some other proposals in there that don't have as much support, like $400 billion for home health care, another $200 billion for affordable housing. But that's the genesis of what Biden wants to spend on. He's targeting about $250 billion per year of additional spending over the next 8 years. But as you know, we have a $4 trillion budget deficit right now from all this emergency spending that we've done from COVID. And so there are proposals to raise taxes to fund this infrastructure spending, very different than the COVID package. And the way that I would explain the COVID package in the first quarter was all candy, lots of government spending, lots of vaccines going into people's arms. Everybody was better off. What I would argue is that we're now moving into the spinach phase of the agenda, where you get more government spending, and that's the candy, but we also have to get the spinach, which are those tax increases to pay for that spending. Okay, so that's number one. On this, and those tax increases are corporate tax increases to pay for that physical infrastructure. The second part of the Biden agenda, which is the social policy, has the individual income tax increases that are getting a lot of attention from investors today. A higher income tax at a 43.4% income tax rate. So the top rate goes from 37 to 39.6 and a 3.8% tax on top of it. Capital gains and dividend income being equalized with wage income at a 43.4% rate. A massive change in how the United States thinks about treating capital income versus wage income. And we haven't had a 40% capital gains rate since 1978. By the way, there's a reason why we haven't had one since 1978, because it was bad policy. And we actually ended up having to reduce it to about 28% then under President Jimmy Carter. And then very significant changes to the estate tax. Now, there was a headline on Bloomberg right before the Biden plan started to come out. It says, Biden not going to raise the estate tax. And then the proposal comes out, and it really was the creation of a brand new estate tax, as we like to call it, where you would tax unrealized capital gains at death. And at the same time, you would move from a step-up basis to a carryover basis. Now, if we just look at how a typical estate is taxed, the effective rate on an estate today is about 37%. This proposal would raise the effective rate on an estate to about 61%. So it's almost like a doubling of the estate tax without touching the estate tax rate or the estate tax exemption. And the money from these individual tax increases would then be used to fund free community college, paid family leave, a more generous child credit, as well as an expansion of the Affordable Care Act, or otherwise known as Obamacare. So it's a really broad agenda. It's $4 trillion of spending. It's $4 trillion of tax increases. And my sense is that a lot of that is going to start to get whittled down as we begin the legislative process for two reasons. One, Congress doesn't want to do all that spending now that the emergency is going away. And two, some of these tax increases are really, really hard to digest, even for Democratic members of Congress in both the House and Senate. And we can break those issues apart and get more in detail about what is more likely.
I would love to start there, Dan, because these tax increases have a direct impact on our clients. It's been a topic of conversation since really the election was over in November. If we focus on the capital gains tax increases first, very broad measure to increase capital gains taxes or double the capital gains tax. How likely do you think that is to hold up? Do you think a middle ground is possible? Maybe give some history on Joe Biden himself and where he stood on capital gains taxes in the past.
Absolutely. Excellent question. And I think a really great place to start. Joe Biden is a more left of center Democrat on tax policy than I think the market consensus really believes. They see him as a moderate, a deal maker. By the way, most of the deals that happened under the Obama administration between Obama and the Republicans was brokered by Joe Biden. And I understand why the consensus would have that view. But on tax policy, historically, he's been far more closer to Bernie Sanders than he has been to, say, Joe Manchin or some of the moderates. And I can tell you in 2015, he was advocating for equalizing capital gains and dividend tax rates at ordinary income. And I think that's significant because in 2015, that was not a cool position in the Democratic Party. In fact, Hillary Clinton's proposal when she was running for president at that time was 28%, but you got a lower capital gains rate the longer you held an asset. So what Biden was proposing in 2015 was far outside the mainstream of the Democratic Party. And it feels as if the mainstream of the Democratic Party has come closer to where Biden is. And I believe that when he puts this proposal out and he transmits it to Congress, he's going to fight for that 43.4% capital gains tax rate on dividends and capital gains. But what I would say is that it's running into some level of opposition in Congress. And I should have said this at the beginning, and I apologize for not saying this, but you have a 50-50 Senate. So that means if the Democrats are going to pass tax increases with Democratic only votes, they can lose no votes in the Senate. And the House is the smallest Democratic majority that we could find on record in 140 years, where right now, if a vote was today, the Democrats could lose 2 members of Congress. Think about the 1993 tax increase that Bill Clinton had. The 40 Democrats voted no. Okay, They can only lose 2 today. And so that means if we're going to do tax increases, the moderates are going to start whittling this down. And I'll just give you one example. The capital gains and dividend tax increase impacts anybody with income over $1 million, total income under the Biden proposal. 65% of all millionaires in this country are represented by a Democratic member of Congress. Many of them are in high income districts in New Jersey, New York, some now in the Georgia suburbs, Texas suburbs. So you're starting to see that broaden out a little bit. And in California is another area. And my sense here is that it's going to be very hard for those members of Congress who are already facing tough re-elections to go with this 43.4% rate. That's in the House. In the Senate, we already have 5 to 7 members who are saying, I'm not for a 43.4% rate. And so just from the pure politics of this, I actually think it's going to get winnowed down. Second is that there's revenue concerns about how high you go on the rate. Because historically, every time we've raised the capital gains tax, capital gains realizations come lower. And that makes sense to us. It's a voluntary tax. If you raise the rate too much, lower realizations. Well, if people aren't realizing their capital gains, that means the government's not getting any tax revenue from that. And so the maximizing tax rate is about 28%. Any rate increase over 28% begins to lose money to the government in the government revenue models. okay? So that means that there's a natural limit from a revenue perspective, and there's some interaction with the estate tax, which we'll talk about when we talk about the estate tax. But my sense is that we're going to end up right around 28% on the rate with the 3.8% Obamacare tax. So it's about 31.8% is probably where you're going to see the sweet spot around that capital gains tax rate. There are a couple of considerations that I would just suggest, right? Is it going to be a big cliff? Like right at $1 million, do you go to that rate? Well, a lot of people will make $999,000 next year if that's the case, because that marginal tax rate will be too high. So something we're watching is whether they're going to try and attach the capital gains tax rate income limits to where the ordinary income tax rate limits are. So if you're in the 39.6% rate, are you paying 28% on capital gains, and try and equalize it that? That is something that will get decided later. Nobody really knows an answer, but I think would be important from an investment perspective. The second, and I think this is the most important issue for investors out there, is whether the tax increase will be retroactive on capital gains or not. I just want to say we have never done a retroactive capital gains tax increase in U.S. history. Every time we've raised a capital gains tax, it has been prospective, meaning at the moment that that bill got signed. That was true in '69. That was true in 1976. That was true in 2012. And even in 1987, we gave investors a few months before the higher tax rate went up. That doesn't mean that it's not going to be retroactive this time. It possibly could be. And there's different probabilities around it. But once legislation gets introduced, once you have a first committee hearing, that's probably going to start the clock on when a capital gains tax increase can go into effect. So if you have planning decisions that you need to make today, I would make sure to get in touch with your Edge financial representative to make sure that you are working to make sure that everything is in order in your own finances, just to get a clean bill of health before any of these tax changes can take effect.
Thank you, Dan. And we'll definitely go through some of those key dates in a moment.
Yep.
So it sounds like your base case takeaway from capital gains is likely a 28% rate, likely not a retroactive, potentially targeting the $1 million income mark. But if it was to go down to federal income tax rates, that is still to be debated, anywhere from $400,000 to $650,000 approximately for joint couples. Do you have any comments on those levels?
Yeah. So listen, I think this is an underappreciated story right now, is that if we're not going to get the revenue at 43.4%, we got to make it up somewhere else. And the way you make it up somewhere else is that you go down the income spectrum and you start taking it from more people. And so again, I would just say that there's probably broader support to tax more people at a lower rate than tax few people at a very high rate. And we just got to work through that. And I don't want to scare anybody and say it's guaranteed, but I just think that starts to become an alternative once the 43.4% is viewed as not politically feasible in the House or Senate. And just something that we're keeping an eye on, where you almost have a marginal tax rate now on capital gains like you do on income. And we just haven't had that in a very long time. Largely, we've been 20% corporate capital gains rate or 28% rate. That's been the rate. And so I probably see some appetite for that.
Let's shift a little bit to the estate tax. You touched on it briefly. Huge potential impacts for many of our clients if the step up in basis at date of death is taken away. Let's break that down a little bit and talk about how likely that is to hold, or how likely, another proposal would be coming in that actually raises estate tax rates and lowers the exemption, a more traditional way to tax estates.
Yeah, so first, let me, again, give you a bit of history. In 1976, Congress changed from a step up in basis to a carryover basis. And by the way, the 76 tax bill was just so bad. We went to like 40 on capital gains, carryover basis. So a lot of the ideas that we're talking about today have been done between the 69 and 76 tax increase. But the reason why it's important to the question that you just asked is that Congress repealed the carryover basis just 3 years later because it was an administrative nightmare and really was an unworkable policy. there were 4 senators who voted to keep a carryover basis in place despite its widespread acknowledgement of failure. And one of those was the senator from Delaware, who is now president of the United States, Joe Biden. So like the capital gains and dividends, I believe that he very much believes in a carryover basis, and he is going to fight for that, okay, and fight hard for that. One of the reasons why is not just on an issue of fairness, but as you start to think about capital gains being taxed, you can change the maximum tax rate on capital gains above 28% if you have mandatory capital gains taxes at death. Okay, so that's both through the step up, moving to a carryover, and the unrealized capital gains tax at death. Because I always say that investors will change their behavior in response to higher capital gains tax rates, but dead people can't. They're dead. So we're going to put a tax on them. And they think they're going to get a more favorable revenue score by having this interaction with capital gains and estate tax provisions that are in there. So just got to be mindful of that. Everything seems to be interconnected here. It's a very thoughtful approach by the Biden team in thinking through this. But I used to lobby on estate tax issues, and I used to lobby on capital gains tax issues. And if you ask me which tax is harder to raise today, I would actually argue the estate tax would be harder to raise than the capital gains tax rate. We have a lot of income inequality, no real sympathy for Wall Street and traders. Capital gains can go up. The politics of the estate tax are far more complicated than that. Family farms, family businesses, very much of legacy generational transfers, existing planning that's already in place. And I have seen a tremendous level of pushback from the 2 main items that Biden put forward as his estate tax proposals. And I have to be honest with you, I know these issues inside and out. I have been surprised, even though we were anticipating some pushback, I have been surprised by the level of pushback on these issues. So let me break that down for you. On the unrealized capital gains tax at death, I actually see very little support for that. There is some talk about how you move that over to the heirs, so sort of a mini carryover basis for the heirs, but they get to voluntarily realize that at some time. That's one idea that's coming out of the House. It's not because the House doesn't like the Biden plan, they just don't have the votes for it. And then just generally in the Senate, I see very little appetite for these types of ideas. And what I'm hearing is that the senators are saying, and by the way, you only need 5, so most senators wouldn't mind doing this, but if you get 5 who say no, it's not going to happen. And those 5 to 7 senators are saying, why don't we just raise the rate? And why don't we just lower the exemption a little bit? And, why don't we just do this the traditional way? There is some talk about moving to a $3.5 million exemption with a 45% rate. I call that an alternative minimum tax. I no longer call it an estate tax if you're doing that, because, if you're in New Jersey or you're in some other high income area, you have a few items and you're going to be triggered into the estate tax. So I think there's going to be some pushback in some of those high income blue states about the exemption being that low. And my base case right now, and again, we're just penciling this in at the beginning of the process, but my base case is that the rate can go to 40 to 45%, from 40 to 45, and maybe the exemption comes down to 9 million. I think very importantly, keeping that the spouse transfer from, meaning a 9 million is really 18 million. I think that is the most important mechanism to be able to keep in place. And we're all sort of guessing here on what that exemption can be, but that feels like what the compromise will be on the estate tax, rather than trying to move very aggressively in creating this second new estate tax that is new, complicated, and getting a lot of pushback from key constituencies in the Democratic Party.
So unlike the capital gains tax, which has not historically been retroactive, what do you think the probability of any estate tax changes, if they were to move into that easier path of increasing the rate, decreasing the exemption, how concerned are you about that being retroactive to people currently doing planning right now ahead of, a potential 2022 enactment?
So I'm a little bit more worried about the estate tax being retroactive than I am on capital gains. And the reason for that is that we have historically done retroactive estate tax changes in the past. 2010 had unique circumstances, but 76, 93, they were all retroactive. And you're probably not going to get as much revenue from raising the rate and lowering the exemption. The state tax isn't a big revenue generator. Causes a lot of economic damage, but doesn't generate a lot of revenue. And so they may feel the need to go back 1 year on this by doing it retroactively. But I have to be honest with you, I apologized to my clients last month, largely because Bernie Sanders kept saying retroactive, retroactive, retroactive. As soon as I introduced my bill, that's going to be the effective date. There was another bill that did that. And what I've seen so far in the legislative offers that are being put forward, most of the provisions are starting on date of enactment or starting in 2022. And that's before we begin the legislative debate. So I've actually become more constructive over the course of this year that the estate tax changes may be on a prospective movement forward rather than retroactive. But you always run the risk of retroactivity on the estate tax, just given the nature of the way Congress views those types of changes, knowing that, hey, we're going to start debate on this. And if we start debate on it, then you're going to start doing planning, and that's going to minimize the revenue that the government gets. And they're very concerned about those types of issues. So you just got to be mindful of it. And again, this is why I think it's important to sit down with Edge Capital and sit down and say, okay, what's best for us at this moment in time? But right now, it looks like it's going to be prospective, which is good.
Very good. Very helpful. Speaking of revenue raisers within this bill, Biden is counting on an estimated $700 billion in tax revenue over the next 10 years, simply from revamping the IRS. You've looked at these type of proposals for decades. How realistic do you think that number is?
So I don't think it's realistic. And let's suggest what he's proposing. He is proposing to hire 87,000 IRS agents to audit incomes over $400,000 a year, with the idea that it's going to generate hundreds of billions of dollars of revenue. I mean, the IRS should just send us all a bill and say, here's your bill. And then we don't have to go through the game of filling out all of our taxes and then being audited every couple of years. But, there's a couple of key provisions in this bill, in this proposal. Some of them actually do raise revenue. They want the IRS to have access to your Venmo accounts. They want to know where all these types of transactions are happening. They're obviously very concerned about cryptocurrencies. You see that in the headlines over the last couple of days around that. So if they actually do get bigger access to our banking transactions, both traditional and non-traditional, I do believe that those types of proposals will generate revenue, maybe $100 billion. What's happening here with the IRS enforcement provision, which is the main provision, is it's a spending item. And so the revenue estimators are never going to score that as a revenue score, like generating revenue. So what I think the Biden people are trying to do, and this is not just Biden people, this is Republicans in Congress and Democrats, is what they're saying is, we'll just say it over and over and over again until it becomes fact. And then we have a $200 billion hole, and we'll just say, oh yeah, the revenue, the auditors will get to that $200 billion in there. So I would anticipate that this could be part of a bipartisan infrastructure bill if we are going to move on a bipartisan basis as one way to fill up that gap. If there's not a bipartisan infrastructure bill, then you'll see this proposal come back again. And it seems like we are headed in this direction of having more IRS audits, depending on whether there's bipartisan or a partisan bill. And it will be used to finance some infrastructure. But I don't think they'll generate anywhere near the revenue that people are suggesting. Definitely not 700 billion. And they may even be lucky to get 200 billion over 10 years, by the way. So that's 20 billion a year. But I would expect more auditing. of anybody making over $400,000 a year.
Let's shift the conversation to timing, because that's so important for all of us having client discussions over the coming months. What dates should be on our radar for watching for potential bipartisan support of this bill?
Awesome question. So the Democrats have to make a couple of key decisions. The first is, do they want to do a bipartisan infrastructure bill with Republicans, which will only be $800 billion. Again, these numbers make me quiver when I talk about it, right? Like $800 billion, I'd say only $800 billion. But it's much smaller than 2.2 trillion. So are we going to do that bipartisan bill? And the president's been very clear with Republicans that if he does an $800 billion bill with them, he's then going to come back and do the rest with the Democrats moving forward. Okay, so, but it affects the timing, because if you are going to do a bipartisan bill, which we'll know over the course of the next 2 weeks, that's then going to eat up most of June and probably all of July. Congress then goes away to September. And then we're not talking about raising income, capital gains, dividends, estate, or corporate taxes until September, beginning in September. So that means you're looking at September, October, November for that debate, very similar to the way Trump's tax cut worked in the first year of his presidency, where now you're in the third and fourth quarter. If there is no bipartisan infrastructure deal, which there are still some real hurdles to doing that, we'll know in the next couple of weeks, and the Democrats in the House will get their first infrastructure bill through by July 4th. That will then set up a Senate debate in July. I believe a lot of that is going to be corporate right off the beginning and not individual. But there is a risk that the Democrats see one train leaving and say, whoa, last train leaving, we got to go put childcare on there. We got to go put paid family leave. And that two-bill strategy of social and physical infrastructure becomes one bill. And that's a lot to chew. And if you think about Hillary Care in 1993, which failed, it became too top-heavy. Mm-hmm. And you got to be careful about not making it too top-heavy. But if that's the case, then this debate can really start in the month of July, carry through August and into September, and would have a little bit of a faster timeline than if there is a bipartisan deal, which basically delays it by a couple months.
Who are the key congressmen and women and or senators that we should be watching to see if there's going to be a bipartisan deal?
Yeah, so the first is I would look to Shelley Moore Capito, C-A-P-I-T-O, the Republican senator from West Virginia. I would also look to the Democratic senator from West Virginia, Joe Manchin, who has been insistent that there at least has to be an effort to get bipartisan support. I would look at Senator Coons from Delaware, another leader in the bipartisan group, also a very close personal friend of the president, and Kristen Sinema, who is the senator from Arizona, who's also been pushing for a bipartisan deal. In addition, the Republicans have Senator Pat Toomey from Pennsylvania. He's sort of a free market conservative, not a big fan of government spending, but very active in these negotiations, and Senator Cassidy from Louisiana. At the end of the day, the most important person is President Biden. If President Biden wants to do a deal, then we will do a deal. And if President Biden doesn't want to do a deal, then we're going to go the partisan route. I can tell you that this week, the Democratic senators met with the Senate parliamentarian to go over the rules of doing this on a partisan basis through reconciliation. So I give the Democrats credit. They are operating on both sides. How do we do a deal with the Republicans? How do we do a deal without Republicans? And they are insisting that they are going to get something done on infrastructure. And I think that's right. And they are probably going to get something done on taxes this year. It's just going to be a lot smaller than what President Biden had put forward in his original proposal. So those are the sort of the key senators, key timelines. And I got to tell you, if you go all the way to December, it's going to be hard to then go, oh, let's go back to January 1st. It just becomes administratively simpler to just move everything to January 1st of next year.
Absolutely. So we've talked a lot about tax increases in a short period of time. If any of the tax increases do go through, that should help to tame inflation that we are seeing in the numbers. And perhaps inflation is more than transitory. That's a big debate that is occurring right now. We're seeing inflation certainly in many parts of the economy. Lumber prices have skyrocketed 250% from 2 years ago and are now coming down. What is your take on inflation currently? Do you believe it's transitory or not? And do you agree that if a deal is reached on infrastructure and tax increases, that will have a major impact one way or another?
Yes, that's a great question. And let me say that inflation is the debate amongst investors, not just here in the United States, but across the globe.
Mhm.
And the reason why we're having that debate is less about fiscal policy and more about monetary policy. If you watch the chairman of the Federal Reserve and you watch the president of the United States, they are talking very much like it's 1968. What do I mean by that? We're basically doing a replication of the 68, 69 tax increase as part of this proposal, the 66 spending increases. But the most important part of this is monetary policy. What the Federal Reserve's job is, I try and keep it simple. The Federal Reserve's job is to supply dollars when confidence goes down. Confidence went down a lot 15 months ago, and they did a great job providing liquidity. What is happening is that confidence is now coming back, and they are providing the same level of dollars in the economy, even though there's less demand for that. So automatically, you are going to have more money chasing not enough goods. And that is by definition inflationary. You also have these temporary factors like the base effect. Last year, everything was down. This year, everything is up. So it looks exaggerated. That's a short-term effect. And that's why I believe no matter what happens 6 months down the road, the next 4 months are going to be more inflationary, not less. We're just trying to figure out how this becomes more longer lasting. And to your point, this infrastructure bill is not a net fiscal boost to the US economy because the tax increases are greater than the spending, particularly in year one and year two. What I like to say is that this is fiscal tightening, not monetary tightening. And they're trying to raise taxes on people who have a lot of savings and companies that have a lot of profits as a way to slow down the economy in light of wanting to keep interest rates low. It's probably not sustainable. And at some point, the Fed is going to have to begin to withdraw some of that liquidity that they had. And that's what the market's been a little bit nervous about over the last few weeks is when does that start to happen? And so I believe that we are moving, as I said at the beginning, from the candy stage to the spinach stage. That is a sign of victory that America is crushing COVID-19. The health emergency is ending. We should really just rise up and say, yes, this is what we wanted for so long. But with that, policy has to begin to normalize, both from a fiscal and monetary policy side. And if our elected officials and unelected officials at the Federal Reserve do not pull back on that liquidity, we will see more longer lasting inflation. And when I say that, I don't mean like 70s stagflation, but you could be talking about, 3.5%, 4% inflation and higher energy and commodity prices that go along with it. And that's not something that we've experienced for the last 40 years in this country and is a framework change.
Absolutely. Dan, you've made a lot of bold predictions today. We certainly appreciate all of the insights. We thank you for your time. To all of our clients and to the friends of the firm, we thank you for listening to Dan today. Please do not hesitate to reach out to your Edge team to help understand the issues that we've discussed today and how they specifically relate back to your personal circumstances. We are here for the coming weeks and months to continue to have planning discussions with you and your families. Thank you all again for your time, Dan in particular, and we hope you have a wonderful day.